Welcome, everyone. It's good to be here today. Let's open with a word of prayer and we'll jump into a new idea. Lord, thank you for the beauty of this day. Some might say it's a little overcast, but it's a day in which you grant us the chance to walk with you, to walk with one another, to be a part of your wonderful world. Help us to be appreciative of the moments we have with you each and every day. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So we're going to be talking till the end of May about creation imagery in the Bible. Different stories, different images that are used to talk about the world around us. People are sometimes surprised when I say there are a number of creation images, but there are. First of all, there's two right at the beginning of Genesis, not just one, but two. There are a number in the Psalms, and we'll take a look at a few of those. And then, of course, Jesus used a lot of imagery that was grounded in creation sorts of ideas. And so for the month of May, getting ready for the summer when all of us may have a little more time to be out in nature, to see the world, what I'm hoping is that this will give you some foundations for you to be in meditation in the created world. I love to go out in the outside and just kind of think about the wonder of it all, to be focused on that. And oftentimes I think about passages that we'll be taking a look at here over the next few weeks. I'm, of course, going to start with Genesis 1. 1:1 through 2:4.
You didn't say last week we were going to do Luke?
No, we finished up Luke and John last week, so now we're in creation.
Oh, that's.
I thought we were in John yet.
That's okay.
We didn't talk about
Oh, maybe
John.
we didn't
No,
talk about John. Well, I
Galatians.
prepared for the wrong thing then, but seeing I prepared for it, we'll do this today.
Oh,
I
And
thought
maybe-
it was
And maybe I'll catch up on
That
John
was
next week.
that was the time before.
Yeah. I'm
another
losing my
John.
mind.
That's right. John.
We didn't. Yeah.
They'll have to forgive me.
We can be flexible.
Okay, well, that's kind of you.
Actually, that's what we should do. That should be number one, flexible.
So we're going to start with Genesis 1, and then we may go to John next week, and then we'll pick up creation again after that.
Where is that in the Bible, that Genesis?
The first book, seeing the word Genesis means beginning. So we're back at the beginning of it all. Trying to find the translation in here, because actually the translation Klaus Westermann does on Genesis is, I think, a really good translation that gets us to think about a few of the things in Genesis 1 a little bit differently. And of course, I didn't mark the page, which is
Probably Peterson does that too in the message.
though Peterson, I was going to use Peterson. I looked at some of his, and it doesn't get at some of the important points, I think, in those first verses in Genesis 1. So I went instead with Westermann's translation. And so listen to this. It will sound a little bit different in your ears. And I'm hoping it'll get you to think about some things a little bit different. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was still a desert waste, and darkness lay upon the primeval deep, and God's wind was moving to and fro over the surface of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw how good the light was, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God named the light day, but the darkness he named night. And God said, "Let there be a solid vault in the middle of the waters, so as to form a division between water and water." And it was so. And God made the solid vault and created a division between the waters above the vault and under the vault. And God named the vault heaven. And it was evening, and it was morning, a second day. And God said, "Let the water beneath the heaven gather into one place, so that or the water beneath the heaven gather into one place so that the dry land may appear. And it was so. And God named the dry land earth, but the gathering of the water he named sea. And God saw how good it was. And God said, let the earth sprout forth fresh green plants, which produce seed, and fruit trees that bear fruit on the earth, each of its kind, fruit containing its own seed. And it was so. And the earth sprouted forth fresh green seed-bearing plants, each of its kind, and trees that produce fruit containing its own seed, each of its kind. And God saw how good it was. And it was evening, and it was morning, a third day. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the heavens to separate the day and the night. Let them serve there as signs to determine the seasons, days, and years. And let them serve as lights in the vault of the heavens so that it may be light on earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule over the day, and the lesser light to rule over the night, and the stars too. And God put them in the vault of the heavens to give light over the earth, to rule over the day and the night, and to separate light and darkness. And God saw how good it was. And it was evening, and it was morning, a fourth day. And God said, let the waters teem with living things, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the heavens. And God created the great sea monsters and every living being that moves, with which the waters teem, each of its kind, and every winged bird, each of its kind. And God saw how good it was. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and increase, and fill the waters in the sea, and let the birds increase on the earth. And it was evening, and it was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living beings, each of its kind, cattle and reptiles and wild animals, each of its kind. And it was so. And God made the wild animals, each of its kind, and the cattle, each of its kind, and all animals that creep on the ground, each of its kind. And God saw how good it was. And God said, let us make human beings according to our image. And God created the human race according to his image, according to the image of God, he created it. As male and female, he created them. And God created humanity according to his image. According to the image of God, he created it. As male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and increase and fill the earth and make it subject to you. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens, and over every living being that moves on the earth. And God said, and so I hand over to you every seed-bearing plant over the whole face of the earth, and every tree with fruit-bearing seed in the fruit, they are to serve you for food. While to every animal on earth, and every bird in the heavens, and to every animal that creeps on the earth, to everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every sort of grass and plant for food. And God saw everything he had made, and how good it was. And it was evening, and it was morning, the sixth day. And so the heavens and the earth, with all their adornment, were completed. And on the seventh day, God completed the work that he had done. And on the seventh day, he rested from all the work that he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all his work, which God had created by his action. This is the origin of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So, what do you hear? What jumps out at you?
In the chapter 2, thus the heavens and the earth, didn't use the word vault. Thus the vaults and the earth. Is that different? I thought you said vaults was kind of replaced heaven.
No, vaults replace another word that we often hear when we read this. What word does it replace?
Firmament.
Firmament. Oh, okay.
Because the actual Hebrew, anybody know what the actual Hebrew word is kind of referring to? Kind of like a bronze bowl that you kind of put over. So it's kind of like a dome. So there's this dome that God creates, a structure. What?
My Bible uses that word, dome.
Dome. Yeah. So it's like a dome that gets set over everything. So the image you have there, and this, I always like to talk a little bit about this because one of the problems we have in our modern society is what with this story? We have a running debate.
Match up with what we know.
Okay, so there's this debate between science and religion. Some people say, okay, this is to be taken literally, and this is how everything happens, and science is just wrong for whatever reason. Go ahead.
I noticed one thing. I think he left out the word dominion.
Yeah, instead they said subject or
Yeah.
rule.
It has, I don't know, it's just domination. We want cooperation and stewardship.
Yep.
Obviously.
Well, and we'll talk about that some. Again, we misrepresent what the Hebrew is really all about. But to kind of complete this idea about the dome, the way the Hebrew people and people in the Near East in general, in many ways, saw things is that, and you get it at the very beginning of this passage, that really everything before God starts creating is what?
What, a void? Is that what you're
It's
talking about?
sometimes we use void, but there's more the idea, the deep, chaos. Everything's chaos. And chaos in ancient Near Eastern thinking patterns had to do with water. You look at water and water, people in Israel often didn't like to be sailors because that meant you went out on this chaotic, terrible structure in which you were likely to die. So sailing was not, one of those popular sorts of trades. So the image is that everything's just water. It's this streaming chaos. And so God puts like a dome in the middle of the chaos, kind of cuts off part of the chaos. And then, so part of it's above the dome. The rest of it's underneath the dome. And then God starts to work with that new structure that's set up. Because the idea is, and you'll see this in chapter 2 when we look at the creation story there. When God wants to water the earth, it says it comes up from the ground and comes down from the sky at the same time. The overall idea was that there were like windows in this dome. And when God wanted to send water on the earth, God would open up the little windows. And everything above the dome is what?
Sky.
No. Remember,
Heaven.
you started with everything's water. God puts a dome in the middle of the water. So there's waters above the dome, waters below the dome.
The heavens.
So if you open the windows in the top of the dome, what are you letting in?
Water.
The water. So, you look up at the sky, and the reason that you see blue is because above that dome, there's water. And so God opens the dome, the water comes down. When God wants it to stop, God closes the windows or opens the windows at the bottom of the dome, lets the water come in, and then closes the windows. So their idea of how the galaxy works, and people would say, well, that's dumb. No, it's not dumb. They only had the knowledge that they had. And so this is how they saw the reality working. Now to say that, so then my argument is always if people want to take this very literally, but we don't see the world that way anymore. We see the world in a very different structure. And if we were to take this as literal reality, it wouldn't make any sense to us. We know that's not how all this works. So that idea of the firmament or the dome or the vault is that just all this water gets separated out, and we've got water up here that surrounds the world. And then before God does anything else, there's also all there is of the world is water. And then God separates out the water from the land. So he pushes all the water over to one side, as it were. So it creates the spots where there's the land. So that's the next part of the process then.
Just think where we are today from where they were. And where they were is just a short little time in all the history
Of the
of
universe.
this creation and universe. It's like yesterday.
Yep. So think how much we've learned in a relatively short amount of time,
Yeah.
at least in a scientific way. But the truth would be, in another way, we haven't learned anything new. You know, at an emotional,
The
at a
more we know-
spiritual, in all kinds of ways, we probably don't know really any more than people did. And, you know, at that point in time. Yeah. Because some things are beyond knowing. Some things are about experiencing. Some things are about relationship. And those things are constantly changing and moving and things. And one of the things, well, I was going to ask this later, but so what do we do with this idea that science and religion, we played these off against each other? But they're not really, you know, contradictory to one another. And why is that?
They have different purposes.
They have different purposes. They're talking about different realities. Science talks about scientific reality, which has to do with experimentation, observation, being able to record things over
And
time.
always being open to change that when new evidence.
Yep. Well, and it has to do with being able to repeat the same experiment over and over and say, okay, we always get the same result, so this must be what we're dealing with. But spirituality and faith have to do with our relationship with God. That's a very different thing. And really, this passage in the first chapter of Genesis is speaking more about the spiritual dimensions of reality. I would argue, and it'd be interesting, people want to, you're always free to disagree with me. I always wait for somebody to go, I don't buy that. But but my understanding is this kind of over-reliance on historicity, on factual material, was not the essence of how people thought when they wrote this passage. They were talking about different realities. They did that in poetic ways. They were willing to talk about, you know, images that spoke to them about the spirituality of the reality. So when they looked on creation, they, in essence, saw the fingerprints of God. And they weren't really concerned about scientifically, how did this happen? They wanted to know, they wanted to communicate their belief that all reality bore the mark of God's activity.
You know, we were talking about something close to this a few weeks back. I don't know what study it was, but I had just read it. And it's germane to what you're saying. It's a little book by John Meacham, the historian, who said, I believe in God on the same evidence I believe in love. Both are invisible forces and both have visible effects. That's, you're kind of saying.
Yeah, and I think that that's the kind of spirit that underlies all of this. Now, all of this doesn't exist outside of what's going on in that reality as well. The Hebrew poet who writes, or the poets or the community that brings together what we have in Genesis 1 is really leaning on stories that are already circulating within the milieu of what's going on in that time period. Babylonian stories.
Marduk.
Yeah, Marduk and Tiamat. Which is one kind of creation. So that's what I was getting to. There are actually three different ways that creation gets imaged in those ancient stories. The one you're talking about, Marduk and Tiamat, is saying that creation came about due to a struggle. Somehow one force overcomes another force, and so creation comes into being. And you see elements of that when it talks about God separating something out or overcoming chaos. These are all images of that type of creation, which is a creation story about one God overcoming another God to bring about the elements of creation. So it can be a struggle. It can be a war that makes creation. Or there's imagery that talks about it being a process, a succession of things that function together to bring about creation. So one God does this, which leads to another God doing this, which leads to a third God doing this, and eventually we get
No chaos there.
no, it's more of
Just repetition.
repetition and movement. And we get images of that in here too, that, over successive time, creation comes.
We get that in where? In this?
Well, as we move through the, on the first day, this element comes into being. On the second day, this element comes into being. You have this movement that's going on. The third kind of creation story is about making. Some God sits down and makes something somehow. So in the Babylonian epics, you have that the gods need someone to serve them. And so they go and they take some clay and they winch it together into a person and they bring the clay to life. And the purpose of these people that the gods make is to go and get fruit to feed the gods. So that's how the Babylonian epic sees it. So it's about creation, making, forming things. And we have that within the structures of this too, with God bringing things into being through the word. God speaks, it happens, which is a very Hebraic sort of thinking about things. They see that the word of God has power to make things happen, infuses the world with God's power and strength. So we have that image in here too. So the Israelites were free to borrow from other stories that were out there and mold them into their understanding of what reality is about. The story really comes. Does anybody know when this story was probably brought together? Because this is one of the things biblical scholars talk about, and this is getting a little deeper than I want to go. But biblical scholars talk about the fact that the book of Genesis is a compilation of a bunch of different material from different time periods. So somebody somewhere along the way said, we're going to bring all this stuff together and create this book called Genesis, which is going to talk about the basis for the Hebrew community.
It was obviously oral before it was written.
Oral tradition before that, some written, but all brought in together.
I don't really remember, but was it around the time of the destruction of the second temple in the 500s?
This probably the book of Genesis was compiled somewhere shortly after the exile. So you have pieces that so that this book is brought together at that point. But this particular piece, most scholars now think, was probably composed during the exile. So one of the points of this particular story is that it's there. Remember what's happening during the exile. The exile, the Israelites have been taken off to a foreign land. And what's happening to many of the Israelites?
They've been taken away out of their homes.
All right. And when people are taken away if you're taken away from your community, dragged off to somewhere else, you have two choices. One is to cling to your identity no matter what. So we are Jews. It doesn't matter if you take us away to Babylon, we are Jews, and we are going to live by the code of what it means to be Jewish. The other option is assimilation. Okay, Well, the Babylonians won the war. That must mean their gods are better than our gods. So let's be Babylonian. Let's join into their gods.
Perfect time for a new God story.
Yeah, but it's time for a new God choice. So
Nope.
let's go with Marduk or somebody like that, because obviously the Babylonians beat us up, so their gods must be better than our God. But the author of the book of Genesis wants to say, no, stars and sun and earth and trees, all those things that people are worshiping in this foreign land are not God. They are all created by our God. And our God is the one who's truly at the basis of all things. No matter what, despite everything you might see, the reality of all things is that God is the one who is the foundation. God is the one who is the creator. God is the one who brings these things into being. And that they only exist and maintain their existence by the activity of God. So how would that speak to us in this time period?
Are you talking about, like, my daughter's a geologist, so I know about the creation geologically.
Okay.
But I once heard this, that the scientists are going to be very surprised when they climb the mountain to figure it all out, and there sit all the religious people who knew it all along. In the Big Bang Theory, to go back to the Big Bang Theory. And I think in today's time, it isn't going to interfere with our beliefs.
What banged?
That's how the world started, the Big Bang Theory.
What banged?
It just, whatever they're getting
Where
to
was
that.
it when it banged?
They're getting to it. They're getting to it. The scientists are working
Yep.
on it
And
trying to figure out what it is.
that's Wendell Berry stuff.
Yep.
What banged?
Well, and the difference, I mean, there are many scientific people who deal with the scientific realities of life and still are Christian. I mean,
Yeah.
the difference is, and I think this is how Genesis continues to speak to us today, is that there's a difference between saying we think this is the process that brought something into being, and saying, and this is what causes everything to be.
Yeah.
So you can, it's when science becomes your God, then you cross the line, at least according to the Hebrew poet here, between being someone who observes and sees and grows from the information and what your faith is. So there are a lot of people who put their faith now in science. Eventually science will bring everything to some wonderful conclusion in existence, and all we have to do is wait for science to make its advances and we'll all be just fine. And everything's been moving according to science for forever and ever. The Hebrew poet would say, be careful of that. Who causes science to come into being?
Yeah.
God. Or some economist will say, the advancing economic prosperity of people and the advance of, all these things going on. This is what drives reality. And eventually all of us will be fine when the economic engines of reality get us to the end of time, then everything will be okay. But again, the Hebrew poet would say, and who causes economics to come into being at all? God. Or someone might say, what causes things to happen in the world is the movement of political powers back and forth across the global realities, and eventually all these powers will somehow collate and bring things together. Maybe you're a socialist who says eventually the proletariat will rise up and overthrow the bourgeois control of the government, and then we'll all be in a created heaven of some kind. But again, the Hebrew poet would say, but who is the one who allows these things to even come into being?
I think science has helped us see the need for a human story based in the power of God
Mm.
and a power displayed in the planet, in the earth,
Mhm.
and how essential it is to our lives. And we're seeing it being slowly destroyed by our own greed, our own stupidity.
Mhm.
It's a chaotic world right now. You see things, look what's happening in India and places where I saw a glacier. Glaciers have rivers, and the rivers are drying up because the glaciers are drying up in places. And we need a story like this to make us live together. And it's meant, I think, to bind us as one.
Mm.
That's God's purpose.
Mm.
I'm glad for science, all it's taught us. You know, I keep thinking about what's happening to all that stuff we're putting in the ground. And I was doing it when I was a kid. We had to dump outside a little town. It's obviously a place where nobody's ever going to build a house. And how long is it going to take? And think of all that big place down by Menominee Falls, excuse me, that was going up over there. We'd see that big, what's going to happen to that? I could go on and on. I'll shut up, but you're right on, Dave. I think with the questions and the observations that
Marilyn seemed to have something to say.
I'm just really, when you gave the images, the 4 images, before anybody even said Big Bang Theory, that's where I was thinking, because that's a reality for a lot of people today. That's what a lot of people believe. And I have found that it's helpful for me to, how do I spiritualize that? How do I bring that theory into my experience of God? And for me, the Big Bang Theory throws out the image of God giving birth, of birthing the whole universe. And, when we think of that, and as a woman having given birth 3 times, it is a big bang.
I was just going to say, we got a big bang God.
Yep.
And then you think of all of the growth and development that takes place from that experience, both for the creator, the person that gives birth, as well as, the person that's birthed.
Right.
So I like that image a lot.
Yep.
That's been a good source of reflection for me.
Yep. And birth is another image that gets used for creation, that God gives birth to the reality that we have.
Well, the big message in Genesis is that God created.
Yep.
That's what you take away. It's how he did it, whether it was 1,000,000 years or 7 days.
Yep.
There are those that they hung on to 7 days and they won't give it up.
Right.
That's a joke. And but we're back down to the very basic. And God created.
Right. And seeing where this has come up, why 7 days?
Because it's perfect in Hebrew. 7
Right.
days.
7
is holy.
numerically within Hebrew thinking is perfection.
Yep.
So throughout this, what does God say about creation? It's good.
It's very good.
It's very good. It's just the way it's supposed to be. So symbolically within Hebrew poetic thought, 7 becomes a statement again of, as the world comes into being, this is just the way it's supposed to be. It's perfect. It's functioning as it's supposed to function as God goes along.
I noticed one did when you read this story from Westerman, did you read God made the 2 great lights, greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night? and the stars. Okay, I was thinking maybe, there are a couple little places where things were left out.
Yep. Nope. That's
Yeah,
that's in there.
and the rest of the stars.
Yep.
Yeah,
And
that's there.
the stars is kind of an afterthought. It almost says, "Oh yeah," and by the way, God threw the stars up there
Little,
too. So.
little did the authors of this story know that there are some other suns out there and moons.
Yeah. Again,
Just,
Be-
That's where science is good.
I know.
Right.
That's
Right.
right, absolutely.
well, science gives us a different worldview. That's what I think we always have to realize that when we're reading biblical literature, that because of the advances, if we want to call them advances, sometimes I think science is an advance. Sometimes I wonder how much it's advancing us at all, but it does give us a different worldview of how things function and what's going on in the world around us. But that doesn't need to push out the deeper truths that are available within the scriptural material. I mean, another image that's within this that I love to play around with when I'm thinking about this creation story within the first chapter of Genesis is the idea of chaos. Everything starts out as chaos. And without God, all you got is chaos. It takes God's presence to take that chaos and mold it into something different, something organized. And I've done some work with science and religion, and we at least kind of play around with the idea. One of the forces that supposedly is at work in all of the universe is entropy.
Mhm.
Everything is moving toward
Decay.
chaos. Basically, everything's moving toward chaos. So the energy is running out, everything's running down. Now, you could, even within science, still talk about things like things forming out of that, because there are probably elements of some things come together to create greater entropy. And some people would argue people forming creates greater chaos by the things that we do, so that we are really engines of entropy in some ways. But I think about it more along the lines of, well, how did all this come into being if everything's natural movement is toward chaos?
No. Mm-mm. No, I don't want to disagree with you on.
Okay, that's fine.
I think there's a creation and it's just there. And we are, we can solve the Earth's problems tomorrow, but man won't do it.
Mhm.
So I don't think it's chaos as much as it is man.
Well, and I think the Hebrew poet would argue that the reason that we as people often are engines of destruction and chaos is because we take God out of the equation.
True.
And if God is the only thing that pushes back the chaos, that has the power to undo the chaos, bring order out of chaos, bring life out of nothing, which is the other image that's in Genesis 1, the creation ex nihilo, God creates out of nothing. If God is the only one who has the power to do that, once you withdraw God from that equation, as we as people often do, putting ourselves in charge and saying, we don't need God, we could do this all by ourselves, that what you're essentially going to end up with is chaos, nothing, without God's presence.
So the biggest difference for me with science and with God, who started what, is that people that believe in the science, they want something tangible. They want something that they technical that they can feel. Where with God, all you need is faith.
But you have to do something.
Oh, correct.
Let's just take the what is that? Down in South America where they're cutting back trees.
The Amazon forest?
The Amazon forest. Okay, but here's the deal. There's so many people that need food and they've got to have farmland. So they're starting to cut back the Amazon, which is not doing, it's one of the main things that keeps the earth clean.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you've ever been in India or China, in the cars, it's unbelievable.
Mm.
If we get rid of combustible engines, we can do it. So it isn't chaos as much as it is man.
Mm.
And the systems of economically, the car dealership, well, first of all, the oil people, no way do they want to give up their cash.
Mm-hmm.
So they want the combustible engines. The automobiles say that's too much money to retool. I don't want to do that. Countries even.
And I don't think the Hebrew poet would disagree with that. It's the activity of man and the choices of man that do it, or people.
And I don't think it's from chaos. I think it's just that.
But the Hebrew poet would argue part of the reason that people are doing that is because they've withdrawn from God.
Sure.
They no longer hang on to God. And without that, then the end is, if you make your decisions, act without God, then what you will eventually end up with is destruction and chaos. That's the reality that we live in, as at least the Hebrew poet would say, as people of faith, we know that's true. Yeah. We remove God from the equation. Sure. And yes, it is still our decisions, but if you remove God from the equation, then everything will move toward chaos and destruction, because the only one who can really lead us and guide us and has the power to push that back is God. So you have to have God in the equation somewhere. That doesn't mean people don't choose. It doesn't mean that, we aren't making our own realities in some ways. But apart from that spiritual reality, our movement is always toward destructive purposes, because we become gods ourselves and we say, I can handle this myself. And in the process of doing that, we just make a bigger mess of things. I have to preserve my nation. It's interesting to read Bread for the World. I don't know if any of you have followed a lot of their writings. Most of their information says that if we adopted different ways of thinking and acting, we could feed everybody. True. There's plenty of food in the world to feed everybody. That's not, production's not the problem. Problem is distribution and how we do that, and that the systems we've set up are what are causing the realities that we now face, because we do that based on our own selfish sort of vision of what reality got to be, rather than seeing the whole world as our family.
It's probably the same with the vaccines.
Yeah.
And the tanks, or oxygen tanks.
Yeah, all of that is about our people, however you want to define our people, come first, and everyone else, not taking into account that if we all work together on this, it would be fine. But again, I think within the Hebrew poets' kind of understanding of reality, and that gets painted in this too, that the whole way creation is kind of laid out here in this first chapter of Genesis is that there's this intimate relationship between God and the creation. God speaks to the creation. God is the one who infuses the entire reality of the creation. There's a closeness, an intimacy. And then God calls the creation, and most deeply within this first chapter of Genesis, people into an intimate relationship with one another. So you are the ones who, and this word that we translate dominance, subjecting, rulership, whatever word you want to, had a different meaning within that cultural mindset. It was, if we have the image of God, that means we're supposed to reflect to the world what God is all about. And what's God all about in creation? In this creation story, what is God all about?
Loving what he's
Love,
created. Very good.
caring
This is
for
very
the
good.
creation.
That was good.
You know, pouring God's very essence into
take
the
care.
creation. And when we talk about dominance, what do we talk about?
Getting our way.
Control.
Controlling.
I can do what I want with that over which I have dominance or rule or is subject to me. And so instead, what we're being called on within this passage is that you are to enter into the creation as caretakers in place of God. You are supposed to be the image of God's love and how you deal with the created order. But we don't do that. We instead treat it like ours. Again, the Hebrew poet, I think, would say that's taking God out of what's going on again. And of course, then creation's going to fall apart the minute you do that. It's not, you can't be the power of God in the world. God connects God's self to the world. The good news in the passage is that ultimately there's nothing that can break that connection because God is the ultimate reality in the world. So God will eventually, bring all this back into line. But we in the short term have all kinds of opportunities to mess up the mix by the things that we do. Or we can live as the image of God. We can live as reflections of the graciousness. And you notice God doesn't hear, it's at least, what was I reading? I was reading, my mind is so spacey sometimes. I was reading Walter Bergerman's book on Genesis and this passage. And he talks about the fact that he sees the translation, let there be, as God calling things into being, setting things free to be what they're meant to be, rather than do it or else, which is kind of the way we often deal with reality. Do this or else we will exercise our control over you. If you don't produce what we want you to produce, God instead invites things. You're blessed to go out and multiply. That's the blessing I give you. That's the, I'm not going to control every moment of existence by what I do, but I set you free to be this beautiful reality I bring into being. And God invites us, I think, in this passage to have that same sensitivity about the world we live in, to enjoy the beauty of what it is, to not always have to be in control of every moment of time and make things do just what we want them to do, but instead to be sensitive about the reality of what God brings into being. And then the ultimate expression of that is the very end of the story, which is, what does God do? Rests. Because God's tired?
Because he was done. He did what
Okay,
he wanted to
because
do.
what's done is done, and to
Rejoice.
rejoice. Enjoy it.
Enjoy it.
Yeah.
Just sit back. Let it be. To recognize the goodness of it all.
So what's original is the blessing, the rejoicing. We kind of take original sin as the.
Yeah, I had a great teacher who worked with us some in a class I was in. His name is Dwayne Creeby. And he talked about the fact that, we oftentimes in talking about the reality of our humanity say things like, if anything bad happens, who's responsible for that?
God.
Some people say that, but some people, especially pietistic Lutherans, say, if something bad happens to you,
It was meant to happen.
you were sinful, you were bad, it's all your
Yeah.
fault.
You got-
And at the same time, if anything good happens to you, we say,
Me.
It's God.
it's God who does this. Oh, God gave me this gift.
Yep.
God did.
Yep.
You're talking, and that's also the flip side of that whole sort of thing, which is a lot of people who are very into we're the ones who make things happen have that idea that if anything bad happens, well, God must have done something to put this on us, and if anything good happens, then I did it myself. But the pietistic Lutherans are all about we're just a bag of worms. So anything bad happens, it's us. We did this, But God did anything but that gives you a very stilted picture of what humanity is all about. Because God from the beginning declared us
Good.
good.
Very good.
At the beginning, God says, this is all very good. You guys are all, you are just the way I made you to be. Now we do things then that break in and damage that reality. So the truth is that we as people are both good and broken. That's the mixed
you can
reality
say
we have as
good
people.
and evil.
Well, not even, evil again has that sense of we're opposed to good. Sometimes I don't think we're even opposed to the good. It's just that we're broken. We don't get it. We let ourselves get wrapped up in our own press and think that we're all that. And so we make decisions that we don't even understand the implications of. In fact, sometimes we try to do the good thing and end up doing the wrong thing. If you want a perfect, we just ran into this in our Synod Assembly. It was kind of funny because I was proposing things at the Synod Assembly that had all to do about this anyway. And it was like, well, you just gave a perfect example of why the things I'm talking about need to happen. We have this way of electing people where we say, okay, we have to have such and such a percentage of people of color. And so we have certain positions, certain seats on like the Synod Council and our representation to the larger church, in which we say, okay, we have to elect a person of color or whose language is other than English. All right. And so we were going along doing that in the assembly, and somebody said, there are also a bunch of open positions that say we just need a male or we just need a female. It's all we, just somebody who's a layperson. Somebody raised the question, well, if someone's not elected to one of the positions that we have set aside for a person of color, shouldn't their name, if they lose that election, automatically go into the category of general whoever? Because we still want to denominate them. And that's not the way it works now. And they said, if you don't do it that way, what you're doing is you're actually limiting the number of people of color who can be elected, because you're saying if you don't win in this category, then you can't be elected. So the person was arguing, if any of them who aren't elected should just automatically go into the other category too, then you're expanding the number of people of color who are. So we thought we were doing the right thing. We thought this was the way it was supposed to work, but we didn't see the implication, the deeper implication of what we were doing is that we were limiting it to only that percentage by the way that we were doing it. So now we're going to have to go back and think about that before next Synod Assembly. How do we make all this work? And that's the human condition. Sometimes we think, but we're broken. And so all of our efforts we think are so brilliant and we've got it all right. Well, sometimes it doesn't work out that way. And that's why it's so essential that God be a part of all of it. But I think as we kind of close up, what I really wanted to be the center of this is God calls on us to recognize the wonder of creation, to look at the beauty of it, to see God's presence in all that God has created. So as we go through these summer months, we have the opportunity to do that, to go out and you know, whether it's Sunday, our technically listed Sabbath, or some other time, to go into creation and just appreciate what God has done in it, to recognize the movement of God and the reality that surrounds us, to rejoice. I mean, because this poem is really about rejoicing in that creative power of God, and to embrace that reality, to look at it all and say, here is God at work in all God's glory. And to know that we are a part of that creation that reflects the reality of God's goodness. And to live our lives in that.
Remember the name Philip Chard from Milwaukee Journal Sentinel? He used to write a column once a week, and he was a nature person. He had a ritual once a week, all through the year, cold, hot, whatever. He would just go out and sit on the earth and just observe and feel what he called an energy from it. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. So I think there's validity to what you're saying. I mean, I affirm it. Thank you for putting it here. What, by the way, do we read for next week?
Read, John. I'll go back.
No, I don't want.
John, we already
I
read,
think
John.
this is great. This
Yeah,
this is a
when you
great
get into the
topic.
Second creation story.
That was going to be next week, but if we do
But
John,
no,
no,
let's
just
stick
go to
with it.
2. Okay,
Let's do what you're.
we'll go
you're
to
ready for.
Genesis 2 now.
Okay.
Pick that one
Okay.
up.
Okay.
Fascinating change, not in the God being at the center of it all, but in perspective and how you look at the creation. That's how Genesis 2 is kind of a different look at the created order. So bye everyone online.